Really? Yeah. Good evening. We're going to start out in Psalm 35. If you want to go ahead and turn there, we'll look Psalm 35, 36 kind of go together. So we're going to look at those a little bit together. One of the things that helps me as I look at a psalm is to first try to get the overall picture. Sometimes you can get that overall picture from something like if you have a heading in your Bible, it may give you some idea of what the main idea of the psalm might be. Sometimes those are a little bit off; they're not inspired, obviously, so the heading may not necessarily communicate perfectly what the psalm is all about. But usually, when you get to being able to look at something like the heading or something within that psalm that gives you an idea of the main idea or main theme of this psalm. Once you grasp that, then you come from that perspective at what's being said. Again, the the the, the writers of the poetry of the Old Testament are trying to paint pictures, and so the 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 flowery language, the figures of speech, those kinds of things are kind of trying to help us paint this mental picture of what's going on and exactly what's taking place. So in Psalm 35, you have a little bit of a mixture of what we've been talking about because it really opens up with the writer making complaints. He's being mocked and he's being used, he's being plotted against, threatened. Things are going the wrong way for him, and he doesn't understand why the things are going the way they're going because even the people who are doing him wrong are people that he treated well. So that doesn't make sense to the author. It doesn't make sense because I did you right, and you're going to turn around and threaten me, or you're going to turn around and do me wrong. You're going to do something bad to me. So what he does is he prays for deliverance here in Psalm 35, and so there's this lamentation. We talked about that from the very beginning about the significant number of lamentations and the personal lamentations. And this would be one of those. So it would be partly lamentation because it's woe is me, poor old me, things are not going the way that they ought to, and why have you done this to me, and why have you let this happen to me? So there's that lamentation part of this Psalm 35. And then it moves really to a petition for him to do something to bring about to bring about some punishment for those who have done him wrong or who are doing him wrong. And then he kind of ends by saying, in a very straightforward way, that he is very optimistic about what's going to take place. Really, that's the very last verse. Go ahead and look at the last verse in the psalm. Then my tongue shall tell of your righteousness and of your praise all the day long. So he ends really with some optimistic thoughts. Seems to be very clear. I have laid out my argument against you, God, because you haven't acted. Where were you? Where are you? Why have you let this go on? Whatever his questions might be. And then when you get down to the very last thing, after these complaints, after him wondering where God is and what God has done, then he details the threats to his life, and we'll get into some of that as we kind of run through some of the verses. But then he really sews it up very neatly in that one verse, verse 28. I will praise you all the day long. My tongue will confess, and I will praise you all the day long. Okay, so really this psalm is broken down into three parts. The first 10 verses describe the threats to him. That is the author, describe the threats to the author. Verses 11 through 18 really goes into some detail about those that he has helped, and then the accusations against him from those that he's helped. And there are a lot of other things contained in those verses, but 11 through 18. And then 19 through 28 is some of that same idea of the accusations. Now, in those first 10 verses, there is this frustration because of the lack of divine intervention. Somebody want to read those first 10 verses for us?
Contend, O Lord, with those who contend with me. Fight against those who fight against me. Take up shield and buckler. Arise and come to my aid. Brandish spear and javelin against those who pursue me. Save my soul. I am your salvation. May those who seek my life be disgraced and put to shame. May those who plot my ruin be turned back in dismay. May they be like chaff before the wind, with the angel of the Lord driving them away. May their path be dark and slippery, with the angel of the Lord pursuing them. Since they hid their net for me without cause, and without cause dug a pit for me, may ruin overtake them by surprise. May the net they hid entangle them. May they fall into the pit to their ruin. Then my soul will rejoice in the Lord, and delight in his salvation. My whole being will exclaim, who is like you, O Lord? You rescue the poor from those who are too strong for them, the poor and the needy from those who rob them.
Okay, did you notice verses 9 and 10 describes at the end of his complaints, there is obvious, very detailed complaint, verses 1 through 8, and then in verses 9 and 10, it's kind of a concluding little section there. Those two verses concludes this section of this psalm as he explains why his speech has such passion and there's such feeling and such emotion there, because he wants the Lord to intervene. He wants there to be something done about this unfairness that's going on. This is not fair. It's not right. By the way, isn't that something we see often in the Psalms? This is not fair. This is not right. Why are you letting this happen? This shouldn't be happening to me. I'm a righteous one. They're evil. Why are you letting them prosper? So this kind of happens a lot. Many times in a psalm that's a lamentation of sorts, you'll have this kind of explanation. You want to know the reason, Lord, that I'm so upset? You want to know why? You want to know what the result will be if you'll do something? If you'll just come down here and intervene, if things change and I see your presence, here's what's going to happen. So he describes that in verses 9 and 10. I'll tell the whole world. I'll tell the whole world about what you have done. It's not going to stay on my ear, does it? So the impassioned speech about why things are happening, or why God's not intervening, is then kind of there's a summation to describe the fact that if you'll do this, then I will proclaim your name to everyone. Now, there's something here that I think is significant, because in this statement, what is the psalmist saying that is characteristic of the Lord in these two verses? What does he say about the Lord? What does he say about God in these two verses? Nobody. He says, who is like you? Or depending on your translation, it is literally, there is no one to compare to you. There's no one. So there is within this complaint, these first 10 verses, the complaint and the woe is me, the difficulty and how things are going wrong, and those folks that I helped, they've turned against me and they're abusing me. May you deal with them justly, at least from the perspective of the eyes of the psalmist. This is how I think it ought to go. Okay? But then he closes it out, that section out, by saying, I will sing of your salvation. I will praise you. My soul will exclaim praises to you. That's verse 9. And then in verse 10, what does it mean when he says, my bones will exclaim, or my bones will tell? When you use that kind of poetic language, what are you saying if you say, I feel it all the way in my bones will proclaim? What does that mean? What does that communicate?
Mine says whole being. It's talking about your entire self.
Yes. So from looking at it from the perspective of this ancient writer, this ancient psalmist, 6, 7, 8 centuries possibly before Christ came, and so the whole idea of with everything that I have, to the very depth of what I know to be on the inside of me. What's another phrase that they use oftentimes to refer to the very inmost being, or to the very heart of my being? What do they use sometimes? Study it. Soul is one. What? Bowels. Somebody said bowels. You see the poetic language. Literally, they're all saying the same thing, but they're saying it in different ways, which is to the very depth of my being, I will praise you. I will sing praises to you. You are stronger. You are better. You are bigger. You are mightier. No one is like you. Sometimes in a psalm like this, one of the things that the psalmist has come to grips with is, I can't do this on my own. I can't do it. Now, that is a very significant turn of events in our relationship with God, to come to the point where we've tried to change things, and we've been unable to change them. And so the psalmist comes to this point where he says, if things are going to change, then you've got to do it. You've got to do it. I can't do it. There is no one like you, including me. You see, the psalmist is not saying, if you'll company with me, we will be successful. He doesn't say that, does he? He says, nobody's like you. Nobody is mighty like you. Nobody is great like you. It is only you. Notice what he also says. Somebody read Dale, since you got that, read verse 10 again.
My whole being will exclaim, who is like you, O Lord? You rescue the poor from those too strong for them, the poor and the needy from those who rob them. Okay, so who does he rescue the poor and the needy from? The strong. They're too strong for them. But he acknowledges also that God is stronger than them. So I guess what I'm saying is, I went way around the world to say this, the psalmist is acknowledging that there is nowhere else for him to turn. There is no one else that has the power to overcome those who are the strong ones of the earth and abusing those that they're abusing, doing whatever it is that they're doing to them. There's no one else that has the strength except you, O Lord.
Okay. Observations through verse 10. Anything?
It's not an observation, but I'd like to know at what point in David's life this took place.
It would be interesting to know, wouldn't it? Because it says it is a Psalm of David. Historically speaking, I don't have a real reference point. Anybody?
This says possibly when he was being punished by Saul.
Yes, that may be the only clue that I've ever seen anybody give that it could possibly have been when he's on Saul's bad side. And it would probably fit as well there as anywhere else, because in that setting he's talking about having befriended and helped and tried to do right, and now he's been turned against him. Okay, let's skip down and someone read 14. Actually, we just need to go 14 through 18, though I think you jumped from 14 to a different thought, but we'll do 14 through 18. Somebody?
I went about as though I grieved for my friend or my brother, as one who laments his mother. I bowed down in mourning. But at my stumbling they rejoiced and gathered together against me. Wretches whom I did not know tore at me without ceasing. Like profane mockers at a feast, they gnash at me with their teeth. How long, O Lord, will you look on? Rescue me from their destruction, my precious life from the lion. I will thank you in the great congregation, in the mighty throng I will praise you.
Okay, very good. Now, the reason I wanted to begin in verse 14 because he kind of ends this section where he talks about the things that are going on and some specifics about what has happened, and he mentions I grieve for a friend or brother as one who laments his mother. I bowed down in mourning. Interestingly, the Hebrew word there that's translated mourning is a phrase that means in the darkness or too dark, to the dark. So really, we understand from a human standpoint that when our heart is heavy, when we are in mourning, that's what he talks about at the end of verse 14, when we are in mourning, it is as if we've entered into a darkness. It is as if we've gone into that place of where the mourners go, where those who mourn would go into a dark place. And then he describes the stumbling. I don't know if that's poetic or not. I don't know if he's trying to talk about, you know what happens in the dark, right? You stumble in the dark. So really what David does is he talks about, I'm in this darkness, I'm mourning, things have gone awry, things have gone the wrong direction, and I'm in mourning. And then he begins in the very next verse to talk about stumbling. Is that poetic license? Is he using that to describe how they rejoiced because he was stumbling? It's very, very possible there as well. I think you see, though we've just touched on a few verses out of these 28 verses, that this psalm is very emotional. It's one of those that kind of grips you by the heart. It kind of tugs on those heartstrings because he so powerfully describes his state of mind. He describes what's happened to him. It's very graphic in nature. He talks about traps and throwing nets and all kinds of things that he would use to describe the seriousness of the matter and how there's this difficulty going on. They gnash at me with their teeth, verse 16. Rescue me from the mouth of the lions, verse 17. So it's very emotional. It's very deeply emotional as you work your way through Psalm 35. So you have, I think, in the next several verses, you have a description of the accusations. That's really verse 19 beginning. We've already looked at the conclusion, and so we're not going to go into real detail about anything that's going on in 19 through 28, but just note again that verse 28 gives you this conclusion. Things turn around, things go well. Well, let's look at verse 27. Dale, you got it there? Read 27 and 28.
May those who delight in my vindication shout for joy and gladness. May they always say, the Lord be exalted, who delights in the well-being of his servants. My tongue will speak of your righteousness and of your praises all day long. Okay.
So you see the kind of wrap up in those two last verses, specifically applying to him, verse 28. All right, any observations or questions? Something that came to your mind as you looked through this? We kind of hit on some high spots as we walked through Psalm 35. Okay, Psalm 30. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that it seems like with the language in verses 1 through 10, he's asking God to be my guard. But he talks about shield and armor and all that stuff. And when you get on to 11, you've got words like ruthless witnesses, and I believe it has slander in there. There it's almost there he's asking to be my defense attorney. When you get on down, it's like, be my God.
Yeah, good observation. Ryan's observation is the first 10 verses, he's looking at the significance of the absence of any defense he might have. And then in the next verses, he's talking about wanting, maybe even needing God to be on his side and be like a defense attorney for his plight. He wants him to intervene, change things for sure.
Sort of seems like he's the Lord of heaven, that's for sure. And, you know, if you'll do what I ask you to, Lord, I'll really praise you. Yeah. Sounds sort of like us, do what you want me to do.
Exactly, yes.
Dale said, you know, when Saul was after him, he would have been labeled a criminal. So they would have been trying to kill him, of course, they would have been making accusations. So that makes sense.
It does, yes. False accusations, lies, anything they could do to pursue and capture and take him back.
All because of jealousy.
Yes, exactly. Okay, Psalm 36 is very similar in nature, though the straightforward lament is not as strong as it was in Psalm 35. But in what we find here is that the writer of the psalm, it says it's a psalm of David also, but the writer of the psalm seems to spend more time discussing God's character. There's a reference to God's steadfast love, and there are other references to the benefit of God to man, the greatness of his steadfast love, the benefit to man that's going to be contained therein. This psalm is shorter, it's only 12 verses. So let's look at all 12 verses, but let's read them in really three sections, 4 sections if you count 1 through 4, but let's read 1 through 4, and then 5 and 6, and then 7 through 9, and then 10 through 12. So I'll read 1 through 4, and then we'll let somebody else read some more. Transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes, for he flatters himself in his own eyes, and his iniquity cannot be found out and hated. The words of his mouth are trouble and deceit. He has ceased to act wisely and do good. He plots trouble whilst on his bed. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not reject evil. So who is being spoken of in those first 4 verses? Who's David talking about? Not specifically, but who's he talking about? The wicked. Yeah, he says the wicked. That's in verse 1. The wicked have these transgressions deep in their heart. And so there's this introduction to this psalm in those first 4 verses that gives us his view of the way the wicked behave, and what's going on in their hearts, and what's going on in their lives. The words of their mouth are trouble and deceit, and so forth. Okay, so the next section, verses 5 and 6. Somebody read 5 and 6. Focuses on the steadfast love of God.
Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. Man in peace you save.
Okay, that's 5 and 6. And so the psalm opens up 4 verses, a description of the wicked, and then the next thing he does in verses 5 and 6 is describe the steadfast love of the Lord. What do you find interesting about that, the way that's laid out? I mean, he talks about the wicked and immediately jumps right into the steadfast love of God and his faithfulness in his covenant.
He's getting you ready to know that God will forgive you.
Okay. Dale says he's getting you ready to understand that God is going to forgive even those wicked he talked about there in verses 1 through 4, obviously. What do you find interesting about the way it's laid out here? Halfway through the psalm.
I think he's trying to say he hasn't forgotten God. Now, he's talking about the wicked people, but I still remember you.
Yeah. Whereas in Psalm 35, it was all those wicked people, and obviously, if he's being hunted down like an animal, which may be exactly the situation, then all he does for much of that psalm is describe his plight, the way he feels in his bones. He feels it all, and then very little about the steadfast love of the Lord, very little about how great God is. But if you do, and I forgot to mention Tommy's comment a while ago, but he said that that's much like what we are today is, if you'll help me out here, then I will praise you. That's kind of the way it was communicated. Okay, so 5 and 6 really extols the righteousness, the strength, the power, the glory, the steadfast love of the Lord, all of those things that are described here. Now, somebody read 7 through 9.
How priceless is your unfailing love, both high and low among men. Find refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house. You get. Oh, okay.
He just choked. Go ahead.
Wrong place. Okay, they started getting on themselves.
He's just having a heart attack. Just go ahead.
Oh, there we go. How priceless is your unfailing love, both high and low among men. Find refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house. You give them drink from your rivers of delight. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see life.
All right, that's a continuation. There's some, he begins in verse 7 to continue to talk about the preciousness of the steadfast love of the Lord and how that man should take shelter under the shadow of your wings. Love that imagery, right? We love that imagery, taking shelter under the shadow of his wings, like the mother bird would cover her little birds with the shadow of her wings. So that talks about his care, his protection, that kind of thing. That's really talked about there in great detail. And then when you get down to verses 8 and 9, he continues to talk further about the significance of the abundance of God. He talks about the abundance of your house. Is that talking about the temple, or is that just a figurative way of saying you have at your disposal all of the blessings? I don't know. I don't know if he's really talking about the temple when he talks about his house, but it probably, to me, it seems in this psalm, David's talking maybe figuratively to say, God, you have all of the blessings at your disposal. Like, I have, if I'm away, if I'm at your house and you say, hey, Bear, you got a screwdriver? No, it's at my house. Everything's at my house. My house has the tools, but I don't have them here. So from this perspective, God has possession of all of these things. Okay, anything else? Okay, somebody read 10 through 12.
Oh, continue your steadfast love to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright of the heart. Let not the fool of arrogance come upon me, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. There the evildoers lie fallen. They are thrust down, unable to rise. Okay,
very good. Here he kind of goes back to the wicked where he started in verses 1 through 4. He begins to describe them a little bit further as he talks about the foot of arrogance. Verse 10, he goes back to the steadfast love. Verse 11 talks about their arrogance and the wicked, how they drive him away. And then he talks about the evildoers further in verse 12. So you have this bookend kind of thing here in Psalm 36. First 4 verses, he talks about the wicked. Actually, the last 2 verses, he talks about the wicked. And in between is a whole lot about God's character, his steadfast love, his amazing bounty of blessings that he has at his disposal. You see how those two psalms are a little bit kin. There's a little bit of a hint of a lament in there, but nothing like Psalm 35. Because Psalm 35 is almost wholly a lament, isn't it? But Psalm 36, it's almost turned up the other way, where he's lamenting the wicked, and then most of it he talks about God's character. Any observations about this? Psalm 36. Interesting phrase in there. As Mike was reading that, and I thought about the foot of arrogance. Is that a strange phrase? I mean, when you first read that, it's like, what in the world does that mean? When a king conquered another king, what was one thing that they sometimes did in order to demonstrate their power and their rule over that defeated king? Put his foot on his neck. Is that what he's talking about there? Maybe something like that. I don't know what else it might refer to, because anybody else have an idea about the foot of arrogance? Because that's really the only thing I thought of when I read that the first time. If the foot of arrogance, then, from that perspective, from the wicked, would be David's request, please do not let that king put his foot on my neck, demonstrating that I have lost favor with God. Maybe that's what he's coming at.
Well, I guess we know when this one's written, but if it is also akin to the other one about Saul, he probably, his thought would probably do not let Saul overcome it.
Mm-hmm. It very well could be. And to me, one of the reasons I chose these two is because it really looks like they connect to me. It really looks like there is some relationship. Of course, the fact that David wrote them and the fact that he was under distress in both of them, they could have been written years apart or months apart, but very likely they're connected in some way. But we don't know for sure.
Could it not be saying, don't let me be like them? Don't let me be arrogant. Don't let me come to that point that I be actually my king. And the last part of it, he says that don't let them remove me. And he's talking about remove me from the sight of God.
Mm-hmm.
Don't let me be like them.
Yeah. Nelson's question is, could he be really asking that he not be that arrogant king from that perspective? And that's very possible, very, very possible. The wording seems to be more leaning toward don't let them put that foot of arrogance on me, but it very well could, in application, be a prayer for him not to be arrogant. Yes. When you have seen it, when you've seen the arrogant king, and you don't want to be like the arrogant king, you certainly would make that prayer. Okay, we don't have time to go over Psalm 37, but it's completely different. It is an acrostic, and so it has no real outline. You can't really outline it. You can't say these three verses mean. It's an acrostic, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and it takes each letter and it gives you a significant thought with each of those letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So there is some disconnect, but there is also some things that are connected. Let me give you these two things that I see in this psalm that are connected. First of all, there are several verses in this psalm that talk about the blessing of the righteous. Several verses in there. I don't know how many, 10 maybe, that talk about the blessing of the righteous. In the same way, there are probably that many verses, 8 or 10, that talk about God's punishment of the wicked. So there seems to be, if you wanted to come to try to find some kind of theme through what seems to be disconnected, because it is an acrostic, it would be the righteous and their reward and the wicked and their punishment. You see that kind of as a theme through Psalm 37. Okay, our time is up. Thank you all for your comments.